and welcome to Let's Talk with myself, Regan DeLoggins, and John Kane here on WBAI New York. John, are you there?
Of course I'm here, sure. Hey, I want to apologize to our listeners for last week. We were preempted. They were covering some live hearings of the Attorney General's, I guess, response to some of the police violence issues. So, but we're back, and we've got some really relevant New York City news to talk about, but news that certainly goes beyond New York. And I look forward to getting into it, especially with Regan, because Regan, you are so involved in so much of what's happening there. And of course, one of the things I'm talking about here are the statues issues. I got taken. I tell you, I was surprised to learn that they're actually taking steps to remove what they call the Roosevelt Equestrian statue in front of the Museum of Natural History. That has long been a source of a lot of outrage from both Native people and Black people, because you've got Roosevelt on a horse with both a Native person and a Black person that are essentially serving him. They're carrying his weaponry for him. And it's just the epitome of superiority and all of that. And the idea that some of these conversations coming out of both Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, and some of the ongoing battles that there have been over the Confederate statues has included our concerns and the concerns over the Columbus statues, which many of those have come down. Now the Roosevelt statue, Junipera Serra coming down. There was even an attempt to take down Andrew Jackson in front of the White House, which, although he certainly was a slave owner, what Andrew Jackson is, one of the things that he's primarily known for is being an Indian killer. So the fact that this is happening, I really want to hear some of your take on what the fight has involved. Both you and Shawnee were both involved in some of this, as I recall. So give me your thoughts.
Absolutely. I think that the conversations related to the statues is not a new one. As you said, this is something that a lot of us within social justice communities, especially Black and Indigenous folks, it's something that we have been rallying against and fighting against for quite some time. And also, as you said, there has been conversation about the removal of Confederate statues, particularly in the South. But what you were saying is what is referred to as the Equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt stands right in front of the American Museum of Natural History. And it was commissioned in 1925 to be in front of the museum. It was specifically commissioned for the museum, though it is technically city-owned property. And even though it was commissioned in 1925, it was not unveiled to the public until 1940 as part of this larger New York State memorial to the former New York governor and former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. And a lot of the time when white people, let's just say it that way, when white people look back to Theodore Roosevelt, they talk about, he was an amazing naturalist. He authored all these works about natural history. He created public parks. There's this very nature-based, land-based conversation about Theodore Roosevelt. It's all quite farce, and it's all been nostalgia, because Theodore Roosevelt, though maybe conservative. Okay, so as I was saying, Theodore Roosevelt was, first of all, he was a eugenicist. His father, who was one of the the museum's founding members, was also a eugenicist. The American Museum of Natural History held a eugenicist conference annually to talk about the superiority of the white race that was funded by Theodore Roosevelt, created national parks in order to keep indigenous land away from indigenous people. And then this monument that was created, the Equestrian statue, has Theodore Roosevelt on a horse, and on either side, he's being held, uplifted, served by a Native American man in a headdress, and what is supposed to be a Black enslaved person on the other side, holding his weaponry. And so it's a complete depiction of white supremacy. This president riding a horse supported by black bodies. It's always been grotesque, and we have asked multiple times. I've been a part of the anti-Columbus Day tours at the American Museum of Natural History, organized by Decolonize This Place, in which we go to the space every Indigenous Peoples Day, asking for the statue to be removed, demanding for the statue to be removed, covering the statue in tarps, covering it in signage, pouring paint on it. Like this statue has been at the epicenter of a lot of discussions of social justice and representation of white supremacy in New York City. And there's always pushback. The museum has released multiple statements and even has an entire website called Addressing the Statue, in which honestly it's just a justification as to how the statue must be maintained, how even though it is seen by some people as controversial, that it's still a part of history that should be shown. And as of June 21st, 2020, the museum has asked the city, since technically it's a city statue, to remove the statue from the museum steps. They wrote an entire statement, which is available on the AMNH website under Addressing the Theodore Roosevelt statue, that was put out, in which they specifically are asking that. They say that the museum community is profoundly moved by the ever-widening movement for racial justice, which is it's incredible that it takes the unjust murdering of a black man by cops for them to finally remove this statue. So it's happening. As of June 21st, 2020, the museum has agreed, the city has agreed, de Blasio has agreed to remove this statue, which is a win for all of us who have been asking for years and demanding for years to have the statue removed.
Well, and I want to add also that the thing about the statue is that it is not in any way, shape, or form any type of historical reference. I mean, for one thing, Roosevelt is a 20th century president, and the idea that you've got either an African warrior, or an enslaved man, serving as a porter for Roosevelt, and a fully headdressed native person. I mean, it's anachronistic to say the least, but it simply doesn't represent any historical event or any historical occurrence. It is again, it's taken people out of context, and it's put it into a singular context of white supremacy. And so when I hear people say that the statue is somehow removing it is taking away history. No, if you have a depiction of a statue or any type of representation of a monument that is misrepresenting history, taking that down is not depriving anybody of history. And I think this statue in particular, which depicts no event in history, which falsely depicts three characters. And none of them are genuine in the context of this sculpture. I just think so. Anybody who suggests, well, taking that down is the removal or burying of history, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other claims of what buried history actually is. But I think it has to be pointed out that it isn't just that the statue was offensive. It's that it's inaccurate. It represents nothing in terms of any kind of historical relevance.
And I think that folks in New York City should know that, a lot of groups, including the collective that I'm in, Indigenous Kinship Collective, including the American Indian Community House, including Decolonize This Place, we have been pushing for the removal of this statue for years. I think as far back as I can remember I've lived in occupied New York City for 11 years. And for the past 6 years, I know that we've been pushing extremely hard. And back in 2017, the mayor, de Blasio, established a commission to evaluate the number of controversial monuments around the city, which included this equestrian statue, because it technically sits on city-owned land. And back in 2017, even though we had put on all these actions, even though we had, quote unquote, defaced the statue by wrapping it in red cloth, by covering it in a tarp, by covering it in signage, they had determined back in 2017 that the Roosevelt statue would remain in place, but that more information should be provided. So since 2017, there's a small plaque that says pretty much like, this is a problematic statue and some people don't like it. What are your thoughts? Participate in the conversation on our website at, addressing the statue. And even within the museum, there's a small hall dedicated to what is referred to addressing the statue, in which there's an image of the statue and then little kind of like bubbles, like comment bubbles by different prominent, I'm putting this in quotes, in prominent people within the community and their reactions to the statue, none of which are, folks that have been advocating for the removal of the statue, all of which are academics or politicians or up and coming folks of that kind of stature. And now 2020 is when they finally understand and relinquish that this monument. It took years of us pressuring, and I wonder really what was the push. They say in the statement that the museum made that this emerged after the unjust killing of George Floyd. That's what they say. But this has been a dialogue for, honestly, decades. I know Indigenous folks who were doing actions in the 60s against this statue. So we're talking about decades of work to finally have this statue removed. And the statement from the museum just kind of just glosses over that. They don't say, oh, since the statue was put up, Indigenous and Black folks have been advocating for its removal. That is not put in there. And I think that really it does an injustice to all of the people that have been advocating for this work for decades, all of the people who have been putting in, time and effort and being criminalized for asking for the statue to be removed. And so I really hope that there is more, I am glad the statue is being removed, but I really hope that there's more discussion about the legacy of how long it has taken the museum and for the city to actually hear us in this demand.
Well, and I that's part of the reason I wanted to do the show, because it isn't just about the statue. Some of it is that for whatever reason, this moment has enabled us to have conversations be heard. Oh, look, we've been having conversations. We've been, we've been crying out about this stuff for a long, long time. But all of a sudden, like you say, they'll actually attribute taking the statue down to the murder of George Floyd, which it's kind of a bizarre connection in many ways. But this moment that we're experiencing and why it's so important is kind of embodied by, I mean, look, there's not just this statue. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, are you familiar with what's going on in Philadelphia at Marconi Park in South Philly?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many instances of what is happening, but I would love for you to elaborate about what's going on in Philly.
Yeah, I mean, so at this park in South Philly, a bunch of redneck, white supremacists showed up there with baseball bats and other, weapons to literally beat protesters who had assembled around at this park because of a Columbus statue. And look, nobody was there with a bulldozer. Nobody was there really threatening to take it down, but there were plenty of people protesting the Columbus statue. And these guys showed up and the cops just let them. They never said, look, you got to get rid of the baseball bats. You got to get rid of the chains. You got to get rid of all of your weaponry. No, they just stood by. And in fact, there were people from the media, including Unicorn Riot, which has been a real relevant, online reporter, if you reporting services. Mm-hmm. But so even Unicorn Riot, one of their guys got beat up. Another black reporter, and I'm not sure for what news outlet, was also assaulted. And so this went on and on for a couple of days. Finally, the city decided to take action. So what it is, they put a box around it. They literally built a plywood box around the whole thing. My good friend Donna Van Boyle, she posted right away that they finally imprisoned Columbus in the way that he should be by putting him in a box. I also thought it was kind of strange that they would take a marble statue and put really, really flammable material around it. But that's just me thinking out loud, I guess. So they put a box around and they hung a sign on it. And basically they put the sign on it because they were addressing their concern about the violence that was erupting over the statue. So, and for many of us, we thought, oh yeah, they're just kind of covering up the circumstance. And then days later, we just heard about this a couple of days ago, that the city decided they're going to remove the statue. So all of those white supremacists that were there, they really took their lumps on this one. And there were a lot of, Italian American, folks, I guess. And I mean, it was all white people. All these Trump supporters showed up down there in South Philly to rally around the statue. And frankly, they outnumbered the protesters. But they also showed up with weapons and were demonstrating that they were prepared to use them. So that's a Columbus statue. And this is all happening in this moment. And while I agree with you 100%, Regan, that there's a certain level of frustration for those of us who have been raising these issues for years, that it takes the murder of a black man at the hands of police to finally get attention to it. But having said that, I'm glad we're finally getting attention to it. And my concern is that we don't seize on this moment. And I'm not saying seize on the moment to expand, to address every injustice, although why not? But I'm reminded of what happened with Freddie Gray. With Freddie Gray, there was a lot of reaction to his murder. And once those cops were indicted, all the protests stopped. And of course, they dismissed the charges on like 6 of them, and the others were acquitted. And so you're left like, what did I stop protesting for? And I think in this moment we have to remember that there hasn't been any legislation passed to change anything in terms of police reform. There hasn't been a banning of chokeholds or beating people in the head and face. There hasn't been any substantive change. There hasn't been any convictions either. And we're still in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We've had more people get killed and more people murdered, and entire squadrons of police abusing people as they were protesting police violence. I mean, so I don't think the time is to stop. And I know I keep beating this drum a little bit, but I also think it's important that people realize that the statue issue is no small issue. It is a big issue, but it's also the kinds of things that, as we demonstrate and achieve some level of success, it should encourage us to do more and to take bigger and bolder steps.
I totally agree. I definitely want to touch back on the Christopher Columbus statue, especially the narrative in New York City, because people may disagree with me, but I believe it has been incredibly difficult to have Columbus statues removed at all within New York City in a way that I haven't seen in other communities. Not to say it hasn't been difficult. People have been advocating for the removal of Columbus statues, and we've been seeing them removed. Yesterday the statue was removed in New Haven, Connecticut. One was removed in San Francisco. So we are seeing their removal. However, we get significant pushback on the Columbus statues here in New York City. And even Governor Andrew Cuomo on Thursday, June 11th, said that he disagrees with the calls to remove New York City statues of Christopher Columbus because there's this Italian-American community sentiment that is connected to Christopher Columbus, which for me, I know I'm not Italian-American, obviously, so I don't understand this argument at all. And I think that the quote that Cuomo made on Thursday, June 11th, was so important because it really brought things to light for me, in which he said that, quote, "I understand the dialogue that's been going on for a number of years, but the Christopher Columbus statue represents, in some ways, the Italian-American legacy in this country and the Italian-American contribution in this country," end quote. So I think that's so incredibly important because there is this intrinsic tie between Columbus and Italian-American pride, but I don't understand why we aren't talking about what the legacy of Columbus is and why Italian-American people would want to participate or highlight or accept a legacy of genocide. Why is this where, why can't we remove this statue, and why can't there be a legacy of Italian American contribution that's not inherently tied to genocide? This quote really shook. I think it shook me in a way that I hadn't expected. Was that there is this legacy that is intrinsically tied to Italian Americans, and it's accepted within the community.
Well, and the problem is that it's not. I mean, it isn't intrinsically tied. The whole thing is a completely false narrative. In fact, Andrew Cuomo's justification for the Columbus statues is the exact same justification that the Proud Boys and all these people in the South say about the Confederate statues. They want to ignore the fact that there's any tie to slavery, just like Cuomo wants to ignore the fact that there's any tie to genocide, murder, the Sex Slave Trade Act, rape, and all the stuff that Columbus was oftentimes directly involved in. And so, and this whole idea to continue to further this bullshit about Italian American heritage. Let's be clear. There is for one thing, Christopher Columbus was genuine. Italy wasn't even a country in 1492. It was a region, but
yes.
to label him as Italian is false. He spoke, we don't even know we know he spoke Portuguese and Spanish. I don't even know if he spoke what it would be considered Italian today. He didn't sail for Italy. He didn't represent Italy in his voyage. Even as he landed in the Caribbean, he didn't bring any Italian heritage or culture to those islands. And I'll tell you something more from a so-called American standpoint. Columbus died not knowing that he hadn't reached, and I know there's a lot of negatives in that one, double negatives, that he hadn't reached the easternmost islands of Indonesia. He still believed he had reached Asia. He didn't know he reached, what is called the Western Hemisphere. That's the reason we're still being called Indians and all that other stuff, is because he was trying to get to Indonesia, not India, the country necessarily, but he was trying to get to what Europe had called the East Indies. And so they labeled these islands the West Indies. And so he didn't bring an Italian culture to America in terms of the continents, and in no way, shape, and form did he do that. The legacy of Christopher Columbus is one of slavery, of cruelty, dismemberment, of greed, of rape, and murder. Frankly, many of his actions were actually tied to the mockery of the church, even as the church credited him with the spread of Christendom. He was actually murdering people, executing people at 13 at a time to represent the 12 apostles in Jesus Christ. Now, why would a guy who's supposedly a Christian or representing the Vatican in some way, shape, or form through the crown of Spain be murdering people? And they literally would label these guys the names of the apostles and Jesus. I mean, this is the ridiculous stuff. Again, I got to advocate, if anybody wants to watch a film, Even the Rain is my favorite film on this subject. Even though it's a Spanish language film and you have to read subtitles if you don't speak Spanish, it is an incredible account of the historical significance of Columbus's voyage, so to speak. But again, when I hear when I hear Andrew Cuomo suggest that Christopher Columbus has somehow become a symbol of Italian American heritage, no, he hasn't. It's a completely false narrative. And a friend of mine said, wouldn't it be great if Native people produced the plaques on some of these things? And again, if I produced a plaque for Christopher Columbus, it would say just that he was the preeminent and one of the foremost persons involved in the slave trade. The first transatlantic slave ship wasn't bringing African slaves to the Western Hemisphere. It was bringing native slaves, including little girls 9 or 10 years old, back to Europe. I would say he was a key founder of the transatlantic slave trade, murder, genocide. I go so far as to say the truth that he and his men actually fed native babies to their attack dogs. Oh, and by the way, he has come to symbolize
Hmm.
the heritage of Italian Americans. I mean, how does that last line fit with the other stuff? And if it does, then shame on Cuomo for all of his disavowal of mafia and everything else. I mean, he is so sensitive about his own Italian American heritage, and yet he is perfectly willing to continue to promote Columbus as some sort of symbol for Italian American heritage. It's crazy.
Yeah, I really, and anyone who's listening who doesn't, or for some reason believe what we're saying, or the history that we're providing, I urge you to read the primary sources that are provided from Columbus's quote unquote voyage. They are available online for free, and you can see his own writing, his own documentation, his own men, their documentation, and you can read the actual violence perpetrated against Taino and Arawak people within the Caribbean. Like, it is so overt, and the primary sources do exist, that this isn't just a like, even though Indigenous anger is completely justified and valid, and we shouldn't have to even tell y'all to read primary sources, I would really advocate for folks to do that, because it is gut wrenching. If you need to know that Columbus was a racist, genocidal rapist, then just read what he wrote. It's there. It's all there. And I'm really glad that you, John, brought up Even the Rain, or También Ya Lluvia, because it's an excellent film that is it is fictional, but it's an incredibly well done film about contemporary filmmakers making a movie depicting Christopher Columbus's conquest and working with contemporary Indigenous communities to create this. And it's an incredibly well done film, and they don't pull punches, if you will, and you can hear and see a lot of the way that they intend to interpret this violence. And you can even see the filmmakers who are struggling with, like, how much do we depict, because it is so incredibly violent.
Well,
so
and
I
the,
really,
and the film,
if anyone for whatever reason needs more convincing, read.
yeah, and the film is layered in such a way. I mean, just to make a little more sense of it, it's a film, a fictitious. It is fiction. It is a film about making a film about Columbus, and it is intended to make an accurate film about Columbus. But in the midst of it, you see the legacy of racism that exists even within the filmmakers, and at the same time, the film gets its title from a battle over water in Bolivia, which is where they were shooting the film, because the native people are being deprived of water, or they want to charge them for the water, and they even go so far as to forbid the collection of rainwater, and that's where even the rain title comes from. So I want to mention that. Hey, I also got to mention, look, you're right, all of this stuff is well documented in Columbus's own words, the words of Bartolome de las Casas and other contemporaries. Some of this stuff is from Columbus's journal, but also his letters. And I did a film, a short video. You can find it on my YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. It's called Columbus in His Own Words. I encourage you, if you want to get just a brief overview of some of the language that was used by Columbus and his contemporaries about what they were involved in, by all means, check out again my YouTube channel, Let's Talk Native TV, and look for Columbus in His Own Words. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break. We'll go out. I heard a little music chiming in my ear a little while ago, but we'll go out with a little bit of tune. And when we come back, I want to do a little pitching for WBAI, but I also want to talk more about what this moment is bringing, and including what some of these statues. There's more statues, and one in particular that I want to talk about when we come back. This is John Kane and Regan DeLoggins, and this is Let's Talk. We'll be right back.
All right, y'all. Welcome back to Let's Talk with myself, Regan DeLoggins, and John Kane. We were just having a bit of a conversation in relation to the removal of statues, both here in occupied New York City as well as abroad. John, let's just make sure that you're there and we have a good, clear connection.
Yep, I'm still here, and yeah, I think that's a good overview. I mean, there are a lot of statues that have come down in many places, throughout the world, but a lot of them are connected to, in some form or another, racism and the legacy of racism that goes back to include slavery and genocide and everything else. But before I get back right back into it, let me remind people that in the midst of COVID-19, there are a lot of businesses that are struggling. And although WBAI is a not-for-profit, it is a not-for-profit business. And we're struggling. And we desperately need your help to support the station. And from mine and Regan's perspective, we want you to support this show in particular as you support the station. It doesn't go to Regan and I, but it goes to WBAI, and it sends a message to management, and sends a message to everybody that you support some of the content and the subject matter that Regan and I cover. I know that we are kind of a unique voice in all of radio, not just in New York City, but this brand of radio that we do is different than almost any other program you're going to find out there. So if you support what Regan and I are doing, and look, I've got to acknowledge, look, we're not doing the phone back, the listener calls as we were before. Not only because we're reduced to 1 hour at this point, but with COVID-19, we don't have the same phone systems available to us. So we will get back to that. I do assure you we will do that eventually and get back to having all of you on the program as well. But the one sure way to make sure that happens is to keep us on the air. So make a contribution. Go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a pledge of any size. You can do a pledge through the buddy program, the BAI buddy program, where you become a member essentially, and you become a member of the station. You make a contribution that comes out of your checking account or your credit card once a month, and we get to list you as our buddy, not just WBAI's buddy, but our buddy. And there's a little bit of a friendly competition that exists amongst the various shows to try to get our numbers up. And our numbers aren't bad especially for a 1 hour now weekly show. But man, I'd love to have 100 WBAI buddies making a contribution of anything from $5, $10, $15, $100 a month. That's what would really help us secure our spot on WBAI and help WBAI secure our spot on the FM dial. So again, you can go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. You can go to the website specifically set up for making donations, which is that's www.give2WBAI.org. Or you can just go to the WBAI.org website and follow the links to make a donation. But we are almost always in some form or another in a fund drive. We try to make sure that as we go through these fund drives, that we still provide you with the content that you tune into WBAI for. We probably don't pitch as much as people wish we would, but I'm hoping that you listen to the show don't need to be badgered about it, at least not through the course of this show, that you hear what we're talking about, you support the perspective, even if you don't agree with it, you support the idea of hearing the perspective that comes from somebody like Regan and I, and that you're willing to make a contribution to support it. All right, getting back to what we were talking about. There have been statues that have been coming down, as Regan said, all over the world, actually. But Junipera Serra statues on the West Coast, Columbus statues. One was taken down in Minneapolis. There was other Columbus statues. One in Boston got beheaded. A couple of years ago, I think one in the Bronx got beheaded too. By the way, so these events are happening, but it's going beyond. I mean, it in a way, this moment is creating momentum. There was an effort last week to take down the Andrew Jackson statue right in front of the White House, and I think that was phenomenal. And let me be clear here. Look, it's great to have a city take down one of these monuments, but you know what? If the people do it, I support that as well. And I've said it before. I think people have to understand the difference between a peaceful demonstration and a nonviolent demonstration. There is no violence involved in breaking a few things, including a statue. So, look, if you can't get your city leaders to be responsible to some of these monuments to racism, then I am not opposed to people taking this into their own hands, toppling an Andrew Jackson statue, or Columbus statues in various places. It's almost unfortunate. I don't know if you saw the video of any of this, Regan, but man, they had a rope and a chain and everything around Andrew Jackson, and somehow the police got to that scene before they could actually topple it down. But I'm certainly, and I know from your ancestry, you absolutely have to be somebody who doesn't feel very good about Andrew Jackson.
Absolutely. I saw the videos of them attempting to take it down, and I will say it is one of the larger statues that have been removed. It is a huge. It's not just it's not necessarily tall, but it's big. It's
massive.
Like wide.
Yeah.
It's Andrew Jackson. But it's a massive piece, and I watched the videos, and I know they weren't successful in taking it down because the cops showed up very quickly after they began organizing. And since then, it's been under pretty heavy police protection. But I have no doubt that once maybe a couple of policemen leave, that folks will get back out there and finish the job that they started. And yes, you're absolutely right. Andrew Jackson has a legacy of being a murderer, especially within my nation. And so I'm not a fan. So I look forward to watching that guy tumble right on down to the ground where he belongs, and support him maybe being thrown into the water, as they did in Bristol, which was pretty badass.
Yeah, Virginia.
Because a lot of these monuments that are being removed, the next question is, and I've seen this. Yeah, and I've seen these other questions being brought up. Where do they go after they're removed? And a lot of them are going to be put in storage. And what does it mean for a statue to be put in storage? Like, is it going to come back out at some point? Is it going to go to a museum where then it can be elevated into the form of art as controversy, or controversy as art? So I'm interested as to what let's get rid of them. Absolutely. I am in no way saying we shouldn't. I'm just wondering, where do they go and what happens next with their history of being that's why I'm loving the ones that are getting taken down, stepped on, decapitated, melted. I think that is, let's make them useless as they can be, truly. I also want to urge anyone listening here in New York City that maybe can't be out on the ground participating in statue removal, that there is a mayoral advisory committee. It's called the Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. You can go on their website at nyc.gov/site/monument/index.page, and you can make there is a way to communicate with both the commission, the folks that did the report, as well as the advisory commission itself, and let them know that you want to see these statues removed. It's at least it's a small part in the statue removal. So if you're looking for any more information, that's a good place to get started.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing here. We got some things flying around the room here. Hey, I do want to talk about another statue that was taken down in Washington. But first, I want to. One of the things that people have to understand is there are a bunch of statues in and around Central Park. Obviously, this Roosevelt statue is not, it's right there on the corner of Central Park, up by the Museum of Natural History. The Columbus statue at Columbus Circle is on the other corner of Central Park. But throughout the park, there are so many racist statues, including the gynecologist who used to experiment on black women because he claimed that black women didn't feel pain. I mean, the number of racist statues that exist in Central Park all by itself, I made a reference that it's time to throw away this busted American knick-knack shelf that is the legacy of all these statues, and that's absolutely true. But let me get to another statue in Washington. George Preston Marshall is being removed from in front of what was called RFK Stadium, I guess. And George Preston Marshall was the original owner of the Washington football team and gave it its racist name. And they are removing that statue, which is interesting because you're going to do away with the racist, but not the racism. And of course he was the last NFL owner to allow a black man to play on his team, and he was actually, I take it back, he wasn't allowed; he was forced to do it. The head of the Department of Interior and the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, they basically said they would forbid the football team from playing in RFK Stadium if they continue to ban black players from the Washington football team. So he was he was a devoted racist, and so were and are many of the Washington fans. They used to carry signs during this tumultuous time saying, "Keep the R word, keep them white." So keep the Redskins white. I mean, if that doesn't throw something, just give make your head want to explode. But so you have now this removal of racist statues. Now it starts to get into even the mascot issue a little bit, and so that's become a bit of a controversy or a conversation. Spike Lee did a major interview talking about how the NFL needs to force the Washington football team to change its racist name, and of course, Spike Lee is a guy who is a very prominent Native voice, and he's made or Native voice. I'm sorry, black voice. In this case, Native voice. So Spike Lee has made this statement, and others have joined in. I mean, I've seen some of the comedians like Chappelle and Hughley and a few others have weighed in as well. Hughley. But you know what? In many ways, it is a little overdue to get more and more black players. I wear a shirt sometimes that says it's got Trump's image on it. It says the Aryans, so it's in the Washington football team's colors. And I said, they should call them the Aryans. And somebody said, yeah, but no black man will want to play on a team called the Aryans. I says, isn't that interesting? And yet they'll play for a team that has a racial slur for a name, and that's a true comparison. But I think we're getting someplace, and we're starting to hear. I mean, obviously, Colin Kaepernick has spoken out about a lot of Native issues. So we are getting some prominent black speakers to speak on this issue, and again, none more prominent than Spike Lee. But so it's interesting that this conversation has expanded. Again, this moment has expanded from this racism tied to police violence to really including and so anybody who gets who's troubled by this even by the phrase Black Lives Matter, we don't have to change that phrase. We don't have to say all lives matter or Native lives matter. We don't need to do that. We don't need to change. The movement is what the movement is. But the movement all by itself becomes inclusive because you can't tackle racism and only tackle it as racism applies to one group. If you're attacking racism, then we all are beneficiaries of that fight. I don't know what your thoughts are on any of this, but go ahead and weigh in.
Yeah, of course. White supremacy is a real issue. And I think that there's a lot of conversations about what white supremacy looks like. And of course, white supremacy affects affects all Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. I think it's, this is a time where Black liberation, Black struggle, and Black abolition is really being listened to and heard. And I think as Indigenous people, it's our duty to uplift and participate in that narrative, in that rhetoric, and really, especially for our Afro-Indigenous kin, really uplift what's happening. But I say that to also say that it is, conversations about white supremacy are also tied to anti-Native rhetoric as well. So I see the statues, which of course are symbolisms of of white supremacy being removed, and I see people having these conversations about mascots and the removal of mascots. They've been happening for a long time, but right now in this moment, it's such an elevation and escalation of these conversations that I really think we have the opportunity to make big, lasting impact, to make big, lasting moves. So I think it's all tied together. And I'm hoping that this mascot, the mascot issue really blows my mind, that people are still, in the same way that the Columbus issue still blows my mind. I don't understand why white folks are so why they stand by this so much, why the Redskins name is something that they're willing to really get violent for, or why a Columbus statue is a moment to get violent for. And it's because it's based in the fear of loss of power. This is all about white supremacy. So we're questioning and we're pushing back why white folks have access to resources more than people of color, why white folks are protected by police, why, there are all these really intense, big conversations happening right now. And so these small moves, I don't want to say small as they're not relevant, but these other conversations happening in relation to white supremacy are really heating up. And I think that the mascot issue for me is just so ridiculous, considering that white people tie themselves to a sports team. They're this is my heritage. This is my grandfather was a Redskins fan. Who cares?
Well,
I don't get it.
It actually goes beyond that. I mean, because these obviously are high school names as well, and you have white people who will go so far as to claim that it's them, that they are Redskins, that they are Indians, that they are warriors, that they are Mohawks, Cherokees, whatever else, because they want to take ownership of it. So when we suggest that it's inappropriate in any way or that it's offensive, they really take it as if we're stealing it from them, and that's literally the case as far as their response to the mascot issue. But even in other things, I mean, look at the reaction when Land O'Lakes took the Native woman off the package, and then Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's. I saw white people losing their minds because they felt like their history was being taken. I even saw a few Native people write this long dissertation about the history of the woman behind the Aunt Jemima. Her last name was Green. I can't remember her name, but they went on and told this whole story. And now with the removal of her from the package, that history is being buried. I'm thinking, well, how come I didn't hear it until they're removing her off the package? There's no reason that story can't still be told. Yeah. You don't have to have a mammy stereotype, domestic slave as the symbol of your product. And yet white people were losing their freaking minds over this stuff. But it gets to exactly what you're saying. They feel like they are losing their power to own these images. And make no mistake about it. I mean, this Aunt Jemima wasn't owned by a black woman. And there have been billions of dollars probably made off of certainly millions off of her imagery over the years. And we've seen this over and over and over again where somebody else's image, and oftentimes inaccurate or stereotypical or derogatory image, is being used for white people's either marketing or their entertainment and amusement.
Yeah. And I always like to bring things local. I will say that there's a petition right now to change, or what is referred to as retire the red man, or the red men, in East Islip, New York, in Long Island, because it's the home of the red men, and it's got a native profile with a headdress on, and people from this high school. This was actually the petition to retire the name was actually started by alumni from the high school, which I think is pretty great, considering that it's always the labor of indigenous people bringing this to the forefront. Mm-hmm. So to see people who went to this high school be like, hey, we need to change it, is, I think, steps in the general right direction. And there's been such pushback for changing the name. And I wonder, I went to a high school that was, I went to Brookwood High School in Melville, Georgia. and we were the Brookwood Broncos. And, you know, in high school, we're like, oh, we're the Broncos. There was like this, you know, this pride to being a Bronco, a Brookwood Bronco, right? Like that was like this thing that we carried. I'm almost 30. I'm not like trying to tie my identity as a person to a mascot in high school. Like it's just like not a thing that I've ever really cared for or wanted to do. And I don't understand why white folks really identify with mascots, especially racist imagery, in this way. And I would also advocate for folks who are listening to read Philip Deloria's book, Playing Indian, because he does talk about mascots, but he talks about other aspects as well. And he talks about the legacy of dressing up and playing Indian and how it is, how often white people tie it to patriotism, which is just so contradictory.
Yeah.
So everyone should read that book, Playing Indian by Philip Deloria. He starts with the Boston Tea Party and he brings it into the contemporary.
Well, I think it's
a history of indigenous imagery.
It's worth mentioning that at the time when this becomes a fad for white people, Native children are being beaten for carrying on and for maintaining any level of Native identity at residential schools. And I can't talk about the mascot issue without bringing up residential schools. Kids that were beaten for speaking their language, had their hair cut, their names changed, their clothing, anything that would identify them as Native
murdered.
People. Yeah, and murdered. Yeah. So we're just about out of time. Regan, a great show. Thanks for thanks for your contribution on this issue. We'll look. We've always got more, so we'll be back next week again with Let's Talk. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins. Nyawe, and we'll see you next week.